It was an ancient time, in a distant land called Ur of the Chaldeans. A prosperous place, yet also marked by the worship of various idols and strange gods. It was precisely there, in a setting where it seemed unlikely that God would choose anyone, that something extraordinary happened in the life of a man named Abraham. Abraham was not very young when everything began. He was already 75 years old, married to Sarah. And they still had no children, which in those days deeply saddened the couple. Yet Abraham lived his life with dignity, surrounded by family, friends, possessions, and animals. He had a calm routine, but his heart was always restless, as if waiting for something greater. One night, as he gazed at the starry sky, Abraham was surprised by the voice of God. It was not like human voices, but something deep, clear, and full of authority, capable of echoing directly in his soul. God spoke words to Abraham that would forever change the course of human history. "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you." Abraham felt his heart beat faster. Imagine being called to leave everything you know, everything familiar, safe, and comfortable, to venture into the unknown. It would be a great challenge. But God was not merely calling Abraham to a physical journey. It was also a spiritual journey of trust, faith, and obedience. Then God made a promise that seemed impossible to human eyes, but deeply true in the eyes of faith. "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will exalt your name, and you will be a blessing. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." How could Abraham, who was already old and did not even have a son, become the father of a multitude? A miracle would be necessary. And that was exactly the point. God was inviting Abraham to experience a personal relationship with him, to believe in the impossible and witness his faithfulness. Moved by courageous faith, Abraham did not hesitate. He spoke with Sarah, gathered his possessions and animals, called his nephew Lot and some servants, and announced his bold decision to his family. Although many were perplexed, he knew he needed to trust the divine voice above all else. When the day of departure finally came, imagine that moment. Abraham looked back and saw the city he knew so well fading away, his security disappearing on the horizon. Ahead lay only the vast unknown. But within him, a powerful flame of hope sustained him, the promise made by God himself. During his journey through the desert, Abraham faced doubts, insecurities, and trials. But one thing never changed, the certainty that God was with him. Every step brought him closer to the fulfillment of that divine promise, even without knowing exactly how or when it would happen. During lonely nights in the desert, he looked up at the starry sky, and those words of God echoed in his heart. Each star represented for him a silent confirmation of the divine promise. And so, Abraham moved forward, confident. For the same God who had called him was faithful to fulfill what he had promised. Thus began Abraham's incredible journey of faith. A journey that would change not only his destiny, but also that of countless generations, because that simple man had the courage to say yes to the divine call. Abraham became not only the father of a people, but also a model of genuine and unwavering faith, capable of believing in the impossible and fully trusting in the promises of the Lord. And that story was only just beginning. Years had passed since God made that great promise to Abraham. He and his wife, Sarah, waited patiently, facing days and nights when doubt would quietly creep into their hearts. But Abraham's faith always prevailed, for he knew that God never failed in his promises. One day, when Abraham was already 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90, something extraordinary happened. The long-awaited miracle finally arrived. Isaac, the promised son, was born. Imagine the joy that filled that household. The laughter of the child was a constant reminder of the divine promise fulfilled. The couple's life began to revolve around that beloved son, who represented everything they had ever desired. However, one day, something unexpected deeply shook the peace of that family. God decided to test Abraham's loyalty and faith once again. This was not a simple test. This time, it was a trial that seemed almost unbearable, too difficult for anyone to understand. One quiet night, while everyone was asleep, Abraham heard the voice of the Lord speaking clearly to him. "Abraham, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love dearly, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." Imagine the anguish that seized Abraham's heart upon hearing those words. Isaac was the promised son, through whom God had vowed to multiply his descendants like the stars in the sky. How could God be asking for such a thing? Despite the profound pain he felt at that moment, Abraham did not question or complain before God. His faith was stronger than any doubt or pain. In the morning, Abraham rose very early and began preparing everything needed for that long and arduous journey. He gathered wood, prepared the fire, and took along 2 servants, as well as the young Isaac. The journey to Mount Moriah was long and silent. Imagine how Abraham must have felt, knowing what had to be done at the end of that journey. Every step seemed heavier than the one before. In his heart, he silently cried out for strength, as he walked side by side with his beloved son, who, in his innocence, had no idea of what was about to happen. After 3 days of travel, Abraham saw in the distance the place God had indicated. He told the servants to stay behind, stating that only he and his son would ascend the mountain to worship God, and then they would return together. Notice Abraham's faith in that crucial detail. He believed that, somehow, God would resolve that seemingly impossible situation. During the ascent of the mountain, Isaac, puzzled, asked his father, "My father, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" At that moment, Abraham replied with admirable firmness and deep faith, "My son, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." Upon reaching the top of the mountain, Abraham carefully built an altar. He placed stones upon it, arranged the wood, and then the most difficult moment came. He had to lay his beloved son Isaac on the altar. Yet, the young man did not resist. There was immense trust between father and son in that hard moment. Abraham raised his hand, holding the knife firmly. At that very moment, time seemed to stand still. The man's heart was about to burst with pain, but his faith in the Lord remained unshaken. Suddenly, before any harm could be done, a powerful voice echoed from heaven saying, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Relieved, Abraham looked up, and saw behind him a ram caught by its horns in a bush, provided by God. With tears in his eyes and a heart full of gratitude, Abraham released his son, took the ram, and offered it to the Lord in place of Isaac. In that moment, God reaffirmed the covenant he had made with Abraham, declaring that because of his faith, all nations would be blessed through him and his descendants. The trial was over. God had tested Abraham's heart and found in it a pure, genuine faith, completely surrendered to his will. Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain together, more united than ever, with hearts filled with gratitude, peace, and renewed trust in the promises of the Lord. That remarkable experience became a living testimony of what it means to have true faith, capable of surrendering absolutely everything into the hands of the one who never fails his promises. At the time Moses was born, Egypt was ruled by a cruel Pharaoh, who enslaved the Hebrew people, forcing them to endure heavy labor and constant suffering. Yet, despite the harshness of slavery, the Hebrews multiplied quickly, filling the land with their sons and daughters. This rapid increase terrified the Pharaoh, who, fearing a future revolt, ordered something terrible and inhumane: that all newborn Hebrew boys be cast into the Nile River to die. It was in this grim setting, full of tears and fear, that Moses was born. His mother, Jochebed, when she first saw his face, felt that this baby was special. She decided she would not surrender her son to death without a fight. With courage and deep love, she hid him carefully for 3 months, protecting him day and night, keeping him out of reach of the Egyptian soldiers, who roamed the houses in search of Hebrew children. Eventually, it became impossible to hide the boy any longer. With a heavy heart, Jochebed decided to entrust her son's future into God's own hands. Taking a basket made of reed, carefully coated with bitumen and pitch to prevent it from sinking, she placed Moses inside, gently wrapped in soft cloths. Imagine her expression at that moment, entrusting her beloved son to the uncertain waters of the Nile, without knowing what would happen next. Her sister Miriam, moved by quiet courage, watched intently from a distance as the little basket floated down the river. As if guided by invisible hands, the basket drifted softly until it reached near the royal palace, right where the pharaoh's daughter used to bathe. Upon seeing the small basket among the reeds, the princess felt an irresistible curiosity. She ordered it to be fetched, and when she opened it, she heard the soft cries of baby Moses. Seeing him, she was deeply moved. She realized that he was a Hebrew baby, yet she decided to adopt him as her own. At that opportune moment, Miriam bravely approached the princess and offered to find a nurse to care for the child. The princess accepted, without imagining that the nurse chosen would be none other than Jochebed, the true mother of Moses. Thus, God rewarded that mother's faith, allowing her to raise her son during his early years, teaching him about his true identity, and about the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses grew up in the palace of the Pharaoh, as a prince of Egypt, receiving an excellent education, learning the arts, sciences, military strategy, and Egyptian philosophy. Although he lived surrounded by luxury, something inside him always reminded him that he was different, that there was something special about his existence. Deep down, he felt that his true people were suffering under the Egyptians, and this weighed heavily on his heart. As an adult, one day Moses decided to visit his Hebrew brethren. While walking and witnessing the suffering of the enslaved people, he saw something that deeply disturbed him: an Egyptian brutally beating a Hebrew slave. Overcome with impulsive anger, Moses looked around and, seeing that no one was watching, acted hastily. He killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, he realized that the secret had spread, and even the Pharaoh, hearing the news, wanted to kill him. Thus, Moses had to flee. From a prince, he became a fugitive, leaving behind the comfort and security of the palace. He crossed deserts, faced scorching days and lonely nights, until he reached the distant land of Midian. There, by a well, he bravely defended the daughters of Jethro, the priest of the region, from aggressive shepherds, demonstrating his just, courageous, and protective character. Impressed by Moses's kindness and courage, Jethro welcomed him into his home and gave him one of his daughters, Zipporah, in marriage. Moses then spent the following years far from the riches of Egypt, living humbly as a shepherd in the desert, learning the simplicity of life and the value of silence and reflection. In the quiet of the desert, God was shaping his heart, preparing him for something much greater yet to come. Moses could scarcely imagine that every stage of his life, from his miraculous birth, through his sheltered childhood, his youth in the palace, to his dramatic flight from Egypt, was part of a divine plan, carefully preparing him to become one of the greatest leaders the world would ever know. God was instilling in him the courage, humility, and reliance needed to liberate an entire people from slavery, and lead them to a glorious destiny of freedom and promise. But this grand story was far from over. The true adventure of Moses, the boy who miraculously survived in the Nile, was only just beginning. Moses had adapted to the tranquility of the desert. He had been away from his previous life in Egypt for many years. The days there were hot, dry, and nearly the same every day. He tended his father-in-law Jethro's sheep, guiding them patiently through sands and rocks in search of green pastures and fresh water. His life now seemed calm, without great surprises or emotions. But Moses's destiny was about to change completely. One morning, while leading the flock in search of food, something strange caught his attention from afar near Mount Horeb. It was common to see small plants and dry shrubs in that barren place, but that day there was something different. From a distance, Moses noticed a bright, intense flame burning in the midst of a bush. Yet, the more he observed this intriguing sight, the more perplexed he became, for the bush was on fire. But it was not consumed, it did not turn to ashes. Driven by curiosity, Moses slowly approached. The closer he got, the faster his heart beat, as he realized that what he was witnessing was not natural. There was something supernatural happening in that place. This was no ordinary fire. As he drew even nearer, Moses suddenly heard a powerful, deep, and clear voice coming from within those flames. It was the very voice of the living God calling his name. "Moses, Moses!" Moses was astonished, for there was no one else there but him. With his heart pounding and filled with profound, reverent fear, He replied, "Here I am, Lord." Then the voice said something even more astounding. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals. For the place where you are standing is holy ground." With trembling hands and a heart full of fear and reverence, Moses immediately removed his sandals. That place was now different. It was no longer just a barren, empty desert. It was the very presence of the living God, the God of his ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God continued speaking to Moses with a compassionate tone, telling him that he had clearly seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, had heard every groan, every tear shed because of cruel oppression. He told Moses that he had heard the anguished cry of the Hebrew people, and was determined to free them from that painful bondage. Then God revealed his extraordinary plan to Moses, saying, "I have come to free my people from the hands of the Egyptians, and to lead them to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, therefore, go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh, to bring my people out of Egypt." Imagine Moses' surprise upon hearing this. Suddenly, his whole life, everything he had experienced until now, began to make sense. But Moses also felt fear, thinking of the difficulties and challenges ahead. Humbly and fearfully, he questioned God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the people out of Egypt?" The Lord answered him with words that penetrated deep into his soul, calming his fears and strengthening his faith. "Certainly, I will be with you." In that remarkable encounter before the burning bush, Moses received a clear and powerful call from God. The living God was calling him to something far greater than himself, something that would require all his courage, determination, and unwavering faith. Moses would not be merely an ordinary deliverer, but a man chosen directly by God to accomplish a magnificent work, capable of forever changing the history of his people. Thus, in that silent and lonely desert, before a burning bush that refused to be consumed, Moses accepted the greatest challenge of his life. He was ready to leave the quiet of his simple desert life, and face the challenges yet to come, knowing that he was not alone. The living God, the God of his ancestors, would always be by his side. And that extraordinary encounter, which began with a bush aflame in the middle of the desert, was the starting point of the greatest journey of deliverance and faith that the world had ever witnessed. The liberation of the people and the miracle of the Red Sea. After that striking encounter before the burning bush, Moses returned to Egypt, aware that his mission would not be easy. But now something was different. He carried within him the certainty of the presence of the living God, who would never abandon him. With firm steps, accompanied by his brother Aaron, he presented himself before the powerful Egyptian Pharaoh, demanding that he release the Hebrew people in the name of the Lord. But the Pharaoh's heart was as hard as stone, and he responded with contempt to Moses' words, saying arrogantly, "Who is the Lord that I should heed his voice, and let the people of Israel go? I do not know that God, and I will not let the Israelites go." Yet God had prepared Moses exactly for this moment. With patience and divine authority, Moses began to perform extraordinary miracles before the Pharaoh, revealing the absolute power of the God who had sent him. First, he threw his staff to the ground, turning it into a living serpent, which impressed everyone. But that was not enough to convince the Pharaoh, who, with an even harder heart, continually refused to free the Hebrews. Then God sent over Egypt a series of terrible plagues, each stronger and more impressive than the previous one. The waters of the Nile turned to blood, frogs invaded the houses, clouds of locusts devoured the crops, and deep darkness covered the land, followed by other calamities in succession. These events deeply shook the hard heart of the Pharaoh, clearly showing that the God of Moses was the true Lord, above all the false Egyptian gods. After each plague, the Pharaoh seemed on the verge of giving up, but he soon changed his mind, hardening his heart even more. Until finally, after the 10th plague, the one that took the life of all the firstborn in Egypt, including the Pharaoh's own son, the king could bear the pain no longer. With tears and despair, he ordered Moses to lead the people out immediately. The liberation was finally happening. Imagine the grand scene. Thousands upon thousands of Israelites hurriedly leaving their homes, gathering their few possessions, leading their animals, and walking towards the freedom dreamed of for generations. Men, women, children, and the elderly left their homes, guided by the strong, invisible hand of the Lord. The Egyptians, frightened, handed over jewels, silver, and gold, so that they might leave as quickly as possible. Such was the fear instilled by the powerful action of the God of Moses. But when they reached near the Red Sea, a new challenge arose before them. The Pharaoh's heart hardened once again, and he decided to pursue them with his entire army. Now the Israelites were trapped. In front lay the vast Red Sea, deep and dangerous, and behind came the Egyptian soldiers with war chariots and gleaming weapons, eager for revenge. Imagine the fear that seized the people at that moment. Many began to murmur, saying, "Has God brought us here to die in this desert? Would it not be better to remain slaves in Egypt?" But Moses raised his voice with firmness and authority, calming the people and strengthening them with words that deeply resonated in every anxious heart. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will give you today, for you shall never see these Egyptians again. The Lord will fight for you, be at peace." Then something astonishing happened. God commanded Moses to lift his staff and extend his hand over the waters. At that moment, a strong wind from the east began to blow mightily, miraculously dividing the waters of the Red Sea before the awestruck eyes of everyone. The sea split in two, forming two great liquid walls, solid and towering like massive walls of water, revealing a dry path right in the middle of the ocean. The people were stunned by this never-before-seen spectacle. Amid their amazement, a confident Moses signaled for them to advance. The people then began to cross, watching in astonishment and fascination. Those immense walls of water that seemed to defy all the laws of nature, sustained only by the powerful hand of God. Imagine the sensation of crossing the sea on dry land, seeing fish and sea creatures pass by calmly at your side, yet being unable to reach them. Once the people were safely on the other side, the Egyptians desperately entered the sea, attempting to pursue them, but God did not allow it. Under a new divine command, Moses raised his hand again, and those waters, which had stood firm, suddenly rushed down powerfully, drowning the Egyptian army and their chariots, eliminating the threat in seconds. On the other side, the people gazed in wonder at that miraculous victory. They embraced, wept with emotion, and sang praises to the God who had liberated them so extraordinarily with his mighty arm. That day was forever etched in the heart and memory of the Hebrew people, as the day when God miraculously freed them from the Pharaoh's hands, opening a path through the impossible. Under Moses' faithful leadership, the chosen people took their first steps toward true freedom, toward the full fulfillment of God's promises, showing the entire world that no obstacle exists, that the Lord cannot overcome for those who place their complete faith in Him. But the story was far from over. It was only the beginning of an even more astonishing journey that would forever change the destiny of that people, and reveal to the whole world the marvelous and incomparable power of the living God. After the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, the people of Israel, led by Moses, continued through the vast and arid desert. They walked toward the promised land, but the journey was not easy. Under the scorching heat of the sun by day, and the biting cold of night, the path was slow and filled with challenges. Yet, something extraordinary was about to occur, something that would forever change the destiny of that people, and lead them toward the heart of God Himself. They finally arrived at Mount Sinai, a majestic place rising imposingly before them, covered with dark clouds and lightning. God had chosen that mountain to manifest His presence and reveal to the Israelites the essential foundations for the life they should follow henceforth. There, in that solitary desert, God desired to teach His people to live as a holy and chosen nation. Then God called Moses to ascend to the top of that mountain. The people remained at the base, anxious, waiting for their leader's return. Moses slowly climbed Mount Sinai. As he neared the summit, dense clouds enveloped the place, thunder echoed powerfully, and lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes. The entire mountain seemed covered by a mighty divine presence. making everything around tremble. Upon reaching the peak, Moses entered an indescribable cloud of glory. There, before the presence of the Most High God, he remained for 40 days and 40 nights, in a sacred and unique moment. In that special encounter, God spoke directly to Moses, revealing to him the essence of an eternal covenant between himself and the people of Israel. With his own hand, God wrote the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. These commandments were more than simple rules. They were a guide for the people to live in justice, truth, and peace. Imagine Moses' emotion upon seeing those words, written by God's very own finger. The commandments reflected the character of the Creator, clearly establishing principles such as loving only God, honoring one's parents, not killing, not stealing, and not coveting what belongs to another. While Moses was atop the mountain, God also provided detailed instructions on how to build a tabernacle, a special sanctuary, that would symbolize the constant presence of the Lord among them. This holy place would be a visible sign of the eternal covenant, being established between God and his chosen people. Meanwhile, down at the base of Sinai, while waiting for Moses, the people grew impatient and anxious. Some began to murmur, doubting that he would return, and ended up committing a grave error. They made a golden calf, a false idol, temporarily turning away from the God who had freed them from Egypt. This painful mistake would bring serious consequences, revealing that they still had much to learn about faithfulness and obedience. When Moses descended from the mountain, he saw the people's idolatry, and his heart was filled with sadness and deep disappointment. In his indignation, he threw down the tablets with the commandments in his hands, breaking them before the eyes of the people. This act symbolized the gravity of the sin they had committed against God. Yet, the Lord, in his infinite mercy, gave the people a new opportunity. God commanded Moses to ascend the mountain again. There, for the second time, Moses received the 10 Commandments inscribed on new stone tablets. When he descended once more to meet the Israelites, Moses was different. His face shone intensely, reflecting the glory of God's presence, so much so that he had to cover his face with a veil. Such was the brilliance emanating from him. Penitent for their error, the Israelites clearly realized that, from that moment on, they had to take that special covenant seriously. Then, under Moses' careful guidance, they began to construct the tabernacle exactly as God had commanded. Every detail of that portable sanctuary was prepared with zeal and dedication. Precious curtains, sacred utensils, and the Ark of the Covenant, where the precious tablets of the commandments were kept. From that moment on, the Hebrew people knew exactly how to live, for God himself had guided their steps. The law given at Sinai was not just a set of rules. It was a commitment of love, a sacred covenant, established between God and his people, an eternal pact of faithfulness, protection, and blessing. That historic moment completely transformed the identity of the Israelites. They were no longer merely freed slaves. They were the chosen people of God, guided by an everlasting covenant. Every step taken in that scorching, barren desert now made sense. They walked toward a promised land, carrying the mark of a living, intimate relationship with the God who had chosen to walk beside them. Thus, Sinai became much more than a mere mountain. It became the place where heaven touched earth, where God spoke clearly to the heart of a people, molding and preparing them to finally be a light to all the nations. In a time of many wars and battles, when the people of Israel were surrounded by constant dangers and threats, a different young man emerged, a seemingly ordinary youth, chosen by God for a grand purpose. His name was David. He was just a boy, the youngest of 8 brothers, the son of Jesse, a humble shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem. Few knew that in those green pastures, as he cared for his father's sheep, God was secretly shaping the character of that young man. David constantly faced dangers, such as fierce wolf attacks, and even lions and bears threatening his flock. With remarkable fearlessness, he defended his sheep, using only his sling, a simple weapon made of leather, and a few smooth stones gathered from nearby streams. In the simplicity of the countryside, God was quietly preparing that young man's heart for great challenges. One day, Israel found itself in a desperate situation. The Philistines, fierce and violent enemies, had decided to attack once again, camping on the other side of a valley called Elah. Among the ranks of the Philistine soldiers, a terrifying figure emerged. A gigantic warrior named Goliath, whose height exceeded 3 meters. Goliath was strong and intimidating, clad in heavy armor that shone in the sun, and wielding a sharp spear that seemed impossible for ordinary men to lift. His deep and powerful voice echoed through the valley, issuing a daily humiliating challenge to the Israelites. "Choose a man to come down and fight me. If he defeats me, we will become your servants. But if I defeat him, you shall all become our slaves forever." For 40 days, Goliath taunted and terrified the army of Israel, which remained paralyzed by fear. Not even the brave King Saul had enough courage to face that daunting giant. The hearts of the Israelite soldiers were gripped by terror, while Goliath, confident in his strength, continued to mock and despise the sons of God. In this scenario, an ordinary day turned extraordinary. David, who was just a young lad, had been sent by his father to deliver food to his older brothers who were in the battlefield. When he arrived, he was struck by the fear etched on the faces of the Israelite soldiers. Hearing clearly the insults and blasphemies the giant hurled at God's army, David's heart was filled with inexplicable courage. With holy indignation, the young man asked those around him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the army of the living God?" Immediately, his bravery caught the attention of everyone present. The news quickly reached King Saul, who, impressed by such daring, summoned him. Upon seeing him, Saul was surprised. Before him stood a simple, young lad, with no experience in real battles. But David, with conviction and humility, declared to the king, "Let no one lose heart because of this giant. I will go and face him myself." Saul, worried, tried to dissuade the young man from this seemingly crazy idea. Yet David was resolute. Firmly, he replied, "My king, I have killed a lion and a bear when they attacked my sheep. The same God who delivered me from the clutches of the lion and the bear will also deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Convinced by the young shepherd's determination, Saul offered his own royal armor to protect him, but the pieces were far too large and heavy for the lad. David realized that human protection was not right for him, and choosing to rely solely on God, he removed the armor, took his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook, placing them in a small pouch. With firm and confident steps, David advanced toward the battlefield. Imagine that epic moment. The giant Goliath, powerful and imposing, slowly moving toward him, mocking as he saw that Israel had sent a simple, unarmed boy. With disdain and sarcasm, Goliath exclaimed, "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks and stones? I will give your body to the birds of the air." Without showing fear, David looked directly into the eyes of that intimidating giant, and, in a secure voice full of divine authority, declared, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God who will deliver you into my hands today." The tension grew as David placed a smooth stone in his sling, rotating it with skill and precision. When the giant charged furiously at him, David quickly released the stone, which flew straight through the air and struck Goliath right on the forehead. The Philistine giant immediately fell, defeated. Before the incredulous eyes of both armies, a profound silence fell over the valley, soon broken by triumphant shouts from the Israelite soldiers. David had achieved the impossible, using only a simple stone and an immense faith in the power of God. That moment deeply marked the heart of all Israel, making it clear that God chooses his warriors, not by physical strength, but by the purity of their hearts, and the courage that comes from absolute trust in him. That young man, until then unknown, quickly became the people's hero, and a living symbol of divine victory. In that epic moment, no one could have imagined, but David had not only won a battle, He was also heralding a new era for all Israel. From that unforgettable day onward, everyone began to understand clearly that this young shepherd was not just a brave boy, but a future king, chosen by God himself, to lead his people toward unity, glory, and true worship of the Lord. From the beginning of time, God carefully chose men who, with faith and courage, would be remembered for generations. Among them stand out Abraham, Moses, and David, three characters whose stories have spanned centuries, leaving a powerful and inspiring legacy that lives on to this day. Abraham, the man who one day left his homeland, guided solely by a divine promise, became known as the father of faith. Even without knowing his destiny, he decided to place his full trust in the unseen God, entrusting him with all his dreams and plans. When faced with the difficult test of offering his beloved son Isaac as a sacrifice, Abraham demonstrated a faith so deep and unshakable that God not only spared the young man, but also renewed his promise, declaring that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Thus, Abraham's unconditional trust became a reference for all who seek to understand the true meaning of faith. Generations passed, and then Moses emerged. Born in troubled times, condemned to death as an infant, Moses was miraculously saved to fulfill a divine purpose far greater than anyone could imagine. After a life full of ups and downs, he was called by God through a burning bush, tasked with the impossible mission of freeing the Israelite people from Egyptian oppression. In the face of difficulties that seemed insurmountable, like the Red Sea blocking their escape, or the powerful army of the Pharaoh chasing them, Moses chose to believe above all in the absolute power of God. His firm faith brought deliverance and victory to the people, establishing him forever as an example of leadership, patience, and trust in God's supernatural power. Then came David, a young shepherd, who surprised everyone by defeating a giant, using only a stone and a sling. Later, this young shepherd became a great king, uniting a divided people and leading Israel to prosperity and stability never seen before. In every battle, every decision, every difficult moment, David constantly sought the Lord's guidance. Even in times of failure, he showed deep humility and repentance, always willing to sincerely turn back to God, acknowledging his sovereignty and mercy. His life made it clear to all subsequent generations that true greatness does not lie in never failing, but in the ability to rise, trust in God again, and keep moving forward. These three men, Abraham, Moses, and David, lived in different eras, yet were united by one strong bond, faith. They learned that trusting in God was the secret to overcoming the most difficult challenges and achieving impossible victories. At various moments in history, they faced trials, battles, doubts, and fears, yet they never abandoned their trust in the Creator. Their testimonies have crossed generations, inspiring men and women, the old and the young, fathers and sons to walk the same path of faith and perseverance. Abraham taught everyone the value of complete trust in divine promises. Moses taught the courage to obey God's voice, even in the face of the greatest difficulties. And David left us an example of humility, courage, and constant reliance on the strength that comes from above. Even thousands of years later, when we hear these stories, it feels as if these men are alive among us, motivating us to face our own battles with courage and confidence. How many times in our lives do we encounter situations where everything seems impossible? How many times do we face obstacles as great as giants, seas, or impassable deserts? In those moments, we remember the stories of these heroes of faith and find the strength to go on. The legacy of Abraham, Moses, and David goes beyond the pages of the Bible, reaching our lives, the lives of our children and grandchildren. They are examples that continue to inspire courage, faith, love, and determination. When we share their stories, we realize that we are connected to previous generations, forming a great spiritual current that crosses time and space, leading us all to a living, strong, and contagious faith. This is the true beauty of the stories of these men chosen by God. They are not just stories of the past. They are stories that still transform lives today, encouraging weary hearts and offering hope amid our daily battles. And it is exactly this legacy of unwavering faith that will continue to unite generations, reminding each of us that as we walk in the direction of God's promises, we are capable of overcoming seemingly impossible challenges, becoming, just like Abraham, Moses, and David, protagonists of an extraordinary journey marked by courage, trust, and love for the God who never fails.